I mean, I know you've talked about the physical abortions, surgical abortions, and the trauma that can cause. But I know when I've spoken to people, I mean, I can think of a good friend of mine who went through a rape and became pregnant and ended up having a medical abortion. But I know she described that same sense of powerlessness that you're talking about, because although physically nobody maybe was forcing her and there wasn't maybe no physical contact, there was still this presumption by other people around her that this was the way forward. Everyone was presuming, whether it was the school nurse, the abortion centre, anyone who knew about it was presuming this was the best way to solve this problem. So I think she still felt that same trauma you're describing, even without it physically.
I've known women who've been given the morning after pill and taken it and have that same sense of, oh my God, fathers, what have I done? Because the worst thing for a survivor of trauma, big T, little t, is the loss of agency. So as soon as you've got people saying, this is what you've got to do, then that's already triggering you again. And remember, part of the survival instinct, fight, flight are obvious, collapse. But along with collapse, there's another aspect of the survival instinct, which is called fawning, which is over-compliance, which is when, in the animal kingdom, an animal will make itself look as if it's as little a threat as possible, to play possum, you know. Well, in human relationship terms, it's equally possible that because of trauma, my first instinct is to do what everybody else tells me, because that's how I kept safe as a child. Because I was threatened that if I didn't do what I was told, something worse would happen to me. And this stuff sets you up for the pattern of relationships in your adult life until it's healed. So yes, you know, the loss of agency, the need to placate others. And once again, we need to be so, you know, aware of the reality of, when we talk about women choosing these things, you know, in what sense choosing? Not freely choosing under some compulsion, even if the compulsion is, I'm going to lose the relationship if I don't lose this child, you know. That's not a free choice. It's the lesser of two evils, you know. That's how it's presented. We haven't talked very much about men either, in the sense of their part in all this. Part of the culture of death is we have a lot of very damaged men around. We have a lot of men who have real father wounds, I think. The statistics, you know, we think that probably 1 in 3 women have had some sort of sexual abuse by the age of 18. It varies for men. I think the NSPCC reckons it's 1 in 20 men have had some kind of sexual abuse. It doesn't have to be sexual abuse, as you said. It can be small t trauma. It can be neglect. It can be, again, just how your own masculinity was valued, your own image of fatherhood growing up. And we know that one of the tragedies in our society is that the number of single-parent families, you know, is massive. Now, all credit to parents who are bringing up children on their own, but there is a crisis of boys being brought up only by mothers who go to primary schools, who tend to be full of women. And so we're talking about toxic masculinity, you know. Well, there's nothing toxic about masculinity itself. It's the same issue, which is if no one's ever modelled a healthy masculinity, if nobody's ever affirmed that you can be both sensitive and strong, if no one has ever affirmed the idea that it's okay not to need to dominate women, all of these things are playing into this narrative about toxic masculinity, which is actually just another word for trauma. Because a toxic male is a damaged male. It's not normal. It's someone whose own development has been toxic, and he has learned messages about women, messages about his own sexuality that are toxic. But in that sense, we're all part of our culture, you know. So as partners, these people are going to be pushing for abortions. They're going to be buying into the idea that this is a consequenceless choice. This is a simple, easy thing. It solves the problem. And in so doing, we're allowing men to get away with bearing no responsibility for their sexuality, for how they conduct relationships. And we're encouraging them in the idea that a real man is someone who doesn't need to take responsibility for his child. And again, it's deeply toxic and deeply wounded and deeply damaged. And the more it goes on, the more this recreates itself. And yet still there are people in society who think that somehow this is liberation and this is emancipation, when the fruits of it are all around us.
I mean, what you're saying just makes so much sense with particularly some of the testimonies I've listened to from women and men, but maybe particularly I hear more of the testimonies from women, realising how so often it's things in childhood that have set them up for decisions they've made later on when they've become pregnant. Not necessarily, even casting blame, but just seeing how these things, what the natural consequence or the natural responses of these, whether it's with women and with men. So I think often when I've asked a woman to tell her story, she'll start right back at childhood. She won't start from when she's got pregnant. And what you're saying really helps to make sense of all that.
Absolutely. I think it's absolutely fundamental that wherever there's a capital T trauma, you have to look somewhere behind. Say for what we call the fundamental trauma. Where did that person become voiceless? Where did they lose their sense of a right to agency? Where did they lose their sense of the dignity that's owed them? And it almost always it's early on,
So how do we help these people come forward for healing? I mean, do you think part of the problem can be that can in itself be a painful process?
Absolutely. It's
and be scary.
Very scary. Very scary. And I think it's helpful to think of parts, as it were, because in the aftermath of any trauma, whether it's childhood sexual trauma, whether it's abortion, there's a big part of us that puts, say, our happy face on and just carries on. We all have to do that, but that will work for a certain amount of time. And usually it works because it's sustained by other defense mechanisms. Now, obvious ones are things like drink, drugs, they're a way of numbing pain. And there are the ones I call the more socially acceptable ones, like perfectionism or overworking, or but sooner or later, you see, and these defense mechanisms, it's easy to sort of look askance at them, but actually, again, they're instinctive. They're like the airbag on your car that just inflates because it's danger. So they do what they're supposed to do. They prevent you from the full impact of the trauma. And so it's important, it sounds odd, but it's important to, as it were, rather than say, now I'm a terrible person because I've got drink problems as well, to actually in some sense have compassion for that creative part that was about survival, remember, because that's what we're talking about. That's what the organism thinks. I need to survive. So it's great to have an airbag on your car, but you can't drive your car with the airbag inflated. Mm-hmm. So there comes a point for people where the defense mechanisms are actually part of the problem. And it's usually at that point that someone makes the very courageous decision to say, do you know what? I've got to do something about this. And it's very courageous because there's a bit in Macbeth where he talks about, I'm so deep in blood that I might as well go on. And it's a bit like that. It feels like that. Yeah. It's all so awful. That the only way is through. The only way is to face this pain, is to go towards it. And that requires a great deal of courage. It's a real metanoia, a turning around of your mind in a spiritual sense. And you hear this in other things like alcoholics. Why does an alcoholic one day suddenly say, after 30 years of drinking, today, that's the last time I had a drink? That's a spiritual shift. That's when something of the sense of who I could be is recovered. So we're always looking for that in people because it is going to be very difficult to face this trauma and this pain. it's going to be very, very painful. But actually, even that is the unfinished business, in the sense that grief grows by being unexpressed. It just goes on mushrooming. And we say to people, look, this is hard to understand, but if you were going to be destroyed by this, it would have been then. It's the fear of this that now is holding you back. You have actually survived. It's over. And in neurobiological terms, literally, the brains of people who are living trauma are different from people who are recovering from it. It shifts. Different parts of your brain light up. So that, yes, that was terrible, but that's there in the past. Whereas until it's healed, the slightest reminder of it means I'm reliving the original experience with much of the same brain and body chemistry. And that's why it's so important to have compassion for these people. Because it's easy to think, oh, why don't they just get over it, or they're making a bit of a fuss, or they're attention seeking. They're not. They're literally reliving. It's like a live memory. Traumatic memories are not even created or stored in the same way that ordinary memories are. We learn all this now, say, from the brain scans. So it's a really brave decision to say, I need to change. I need to recognise that there's something fundamentally wrong, and I need to address it. Excuse me. And I think it's also something that it's very hard to do on your own. Trauma is very isolating. I keep it secret. It can often happen at the hands of someone who is very close to me, so that my whole ability to trust, to ask for help, is diminished. So it's really good if there is someone you can trust, and even to, as it were, make that risk to trust again. And just to make the first step, that's the hardest thing. To say it could be different, to believe it could be different, can be very hard, But the truth is that once people begin to understand that there is a etymology for this, that you can trace this path and say, I get it, that's why I did that. And we're not saying nothing you ever did was ever your fault,
no.
Because we all have choices. But we are saying maybe your choices weren't as free as you thought they were. Maybe a lot of them were under compulsion. Maybe some of your attitudes and choices were formed even before you had the use of reason. And maybe the choices in the area of relationships and psychosexuality were overwhelmed before you could ever make them, by the intrusion of something so adult and so inappropriate that you spent the rest of your life trying to make sense of it, even if that's by recreating it.
That makes real sense of people I've spoken to. I mean, particularly when you were talking there about people reliving their trauma. I know when I've sometimes spoken to people who've been through an abortion, and it's just to say that word is so hard because it's almost taking them back there. And again, for people who've been through rape, I know they can't even bring themselves to say that word rape, because it's like they're suddenly back there in that place again.
They are. I mean, in terms of this isn't a memory in the way you think of it. I found a photograph that reminds me of something. They're reliving it, because all those instinctive things deep in our brain, body, psyche were meant to be temporary and efficient. So if I'm being attacked and I run away, even physically I burn adrenaline, I reset my nervous system. Whereas if I'm just passive and it goes on and I can't stop it, as I say, I'm like someone burning the engine out of my car. So yes, this is fundamental to understanding this. This isn't like a nasty memory that comes back occasionally and I put it back in the drawer and then it comes out. It's literally reliving it. And which means that everyday life is very hard going, because I can be triggered by this stuff at any moment. So it does require an understanding of that. And there's one last thing I think that's important to sort of say in that context, and it relates to what we're saying about this being a very much a thing of your brain stem, your primitive brain. The go-to thing has been to talk about it. Get some talking therapy. And the experts would now say that in itself, talking therapy is not enough. Because as you begin to talk about it, so the same neurobiological arousal happens. You're either in fight, flight, you're in shutdown. So that to heal, you need to be able to discuss it in a sort of zone in between, a window of toleration, where I'm not having these extreme reactions where I'm either reliving it or it's so painful that I'm shutting down. So Grief to Grace and Rachel's Vineyard are designed specifically to stop, to create this window of tolerance, to stop the extremes of fight, flight or the shutdown by being very embodied. They contain rituals you have to do with your body, all again to do with scripture. Things you can touch, smell, see, because that's bringing other parts of the brain online so that you can process this stuff rather than the amygdala making sure that everything shuts down except the instinct to survive. So in terms of treating this stuff, talking about it is helpful, but it's not enough. And I'm sure you will have met people who can tell you the story, but it's the same story over and over again, and they need to tell it over and over again. That's not the same thing as actually feeling the feelings. And once those terrifying feelings have been felt, the power goes out of them. But that's very counterintuitive. It's a crude analogy, but if I was bitten by a dog when I was younger, then I'm going to be scared of dogs. Now, I could spend the rest of my life avoiding dogs, but that's going to control my life to a great extent because it means I can't go to the park or I can't even go out. How am I going to heal from that? At some point, I have to approach a dog and have a different outcome. Because not all dogs are going to savage me. Not all dogs are going to attack me. But my child doesn't know that. So it's about having, as it were, being able to connect the adult resource that I didn't have then and the adult brain that says, not all dogs are going to do that. This dog isn't going to do that. Let's see if we get just a little bit closer and if it's okay. And ideally, I need somebody else with me who's going to say, we can do this. I won't let anything happen to you. So that's the kind of model, if you like. It's a horrible, crude analogy, but it's a model for what we do in Rachel's Vineyard and Grief to Grace. We say, look, let's just get a bit curious about this. Rather than having to flee or collapse, let's just get a bit curious about this. Let's get a bit closer and see how much of this we can tolerate. And we'll be alongside you. We're not going to fix you in that sense. It's not a medical model where we've got all the answers and let's heal you. But we'll be alongside you with deep compassion as we go towards this thing that's so fearful and say, wow, that was terrible, what happened to you. Of course, you went on to do all sorts of things as a result of that. But also, you think you're a terrible person because you went on to drink or have an abortion. What an amazing person you are to have survived that. What resources are there? What an extraordinary child you were. And let's clear away some of that junk and recover that identity of a survivor. But now you can be more than a survivor. You can be someone who thrives and says, do you know what? No wonder that happened to me. I don't have to define myself by what I did in order to survive what happened to me.
So just to clarify then, we've got two organisations. We've got Rachel's Vineyard, we've got Grief to Grace. Rachel's Vineyard, primarily for people who've been hurt by abortion.
Anybody's been hurt by abortion, obviously primarily women, but also men can go. Their partners had abortion, grandparents, anybody who's been affected by it.
People who've performed abortions, it could be.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then we've got Grief to Grace, which is particularly to do with the trauma of abuse then. Yeah.
Trauma of abuse in childhood, sexual abuse, but emotional, physical, psychological abuse, neglect, or an adult violation like a rape. And we mix people who've had sexual abuse in the family, in other contexts with people who've had clergy sexual abuse also. That's part of what Grief to Grace is designed to do. Rachel's Vineyard is a weekend residential course. Grief to Grace is a 5-day residential course. They're group processes. In one sense, it sounds counterintuitive that you would deal with something shameful in a group, but actually it's a big part of the healing, because there you discover people who understand the issues. So you don't sit there thinking, I'm the only person who ever felt like this. And the group quickly becomes a very powerful source of solidarity and compassion. So it's one thing to sit, for example, with a psychotherapist who's sort of, I don't want to diminish it, but who's paid, to sort of listen to you, but to have the ordinary human response of other people witnessing your tears, compassionating you. It's a very powerful experience of healing. So the group is fundamental to both of those experiences. And what abuse does, what any sort of secret does, is isolate us. So that part of the healing is actually to recover community and to have healthy relationships modelled and healthy boundaries. And you can practice those in a group.
Final words then, Father. If there was somebody who was listening to this, watching this, who's been through some kind of abuse in some way, maybe struggling to take that first step, worried about maybe not being believed, like you were saying, maybe just never shared this with anyone before, what would you say to that person?
Well, I would say, listen to your heart. If this is touching you, listen to that bit that says it's time to change. We will believe you. We'll absolutely believe you. That's our job, to witness this. Telling somebody else makes it fearful, because it becomes more real when I tell somebody else. But you're telling people who understand, because most of the people who work in these ministries are themselves survivors. They're post-abortive in the case of Rachel's Vineyard, or they've had a history of sexual abuse in the case of Grief to Grace. So we do get it. And as I'm saying, it's not a medical model, which is, oh right, come along, we'll diagnose you and we'll tell you how to get fixed. Come along, we'll listen to you, we'll believe you, we'll weep with you, we'll grieve with you, we'll witness to the truth of what you say, we'll acknowledge your anger, we'll even acknowledge your ambivalence, your sense of, I want to get better, but I don't know if I want to deal with all this other stuff. Take that step, because that voice inside is your inner child, is recognizing that you do have an identity that hasn't been obliterated by this. It might be very small and feel very little, but actually that's who you truly are. Every one of us, no matter what we've done, is a beloved child of God. And that's the Easter message. Jesus has conquered this stuff, even the hideous darkness of all this. All of this has been conquered. And so he wants us to step into the truth of our identity as not just the inner child, where we can recover the dignity and spontaneity and just sense of being happy in our own skin of the little one, but our dignity as people redeemed by Jesus, and sharing in his victory over sin and death and all that diminishes human nature in us.
Thank you so much, Father. That's a real beautiful message of hope.
Well, there is hope. There is hope. Absolutely, yeah.
And I know there's so much more we could say, but I really appreciate you being with us today. So thank you so much.
Great pleasure.
All right.
Thank you.
God bless.
You too. God bless.